In July 2026, a warehouse the size of dozens of football fields burned to the ground deep inside Russia. But this was not an ammunition depot. It was not a military base. It was a shopping warehouse, a vast logistics center belonging to Russia's answer to Amazon. And the machine that set it on fire was not a $1 million cruise missile. It was a cheap, propeller-driven drone, a small aircraft built in a workshop that flew for hours and hundreds of kilometers on its own to find that warehouse. Over a single week that month, Ukraine hit warehouse after warehouse belonging to a company called Wildberries, and in doing so, it opened a new front in this war. Not against the Russian army at the front line, but against the Russian economy, hundreds of kilometers behind it. And the early evidence suggests it may be one of the most quietly devastating things Ukraine has done in the entire war. Because it is not just burning goods, it is reaching straight into Russia's banking system, its budget, and for the first time, the daily life of ordinary Russians who thought the war was something that happened far away. In this video, I want to show you exactly how this works, what Wildberries is, and why it became a target. The much larger drone strategy it is part of, a systematic campaign to strangle Russia's supply lines, the cheap machines making it possible. And then the part that is genuinely stunning, the deep analysis of why a cheap, home-built drone hitting a shopping warehouse might reach all the way into a bank, holding $500 billion rubles in debt. Let's start with the target itself. So, what is Wildberries? Think of it as the Amazon of Russia, by far the country's largest online retailer, founded by a woman named Tatiana Kim, who became the richest woman in Russia on the back of it. This is not a niche business. Back in 2022, Wildberries was the single largest taxpayer in the entire country. It runs a network of over 200 warehouses spread across Russia, moving goods to millions of customers, and it sits at the absolute center of the modern Russian consumer economy. Now, why would Ukraine send drones to burn down shopping warehouses? The official justification is specific, and it matters. Ukraine says these Wildberries logistics centers were directly involved in supplying the Russian army with drone components, navigation equipment, and other military hardware. And this is not just an accusation pulled from the air. Wildberries openly listed drone parts and body armor for sale on its own website. In a war where the front line is dominated by cheap commercial drones, a giant logistics company that warehouses and ships drone components is, whether it likes it or not, part of the military supply chain. President Zelensky framed the strikes as hitting the centers that supply the Russian war machine, and in his words, bringing the war back home to Russia. The campaign itself was relentless. Across roughly 2 weeks in July 2026, Ukrainian drones struck Wildberries facilities in city after city: Tambov, Elektrostal near Moscow, Krasnodar, Nevinomysk, Voronezh, St. Petersburg, Tver, Yekaterinburg, Ryazan, and even occupied Simferopol in Crimea. By the counts that emerged, around 9 major facilities were hit, damaging a combined area of over 500,000 square meters, something like 10% of the company's entire logistics network, in a matter of days. And that figure is not final. It climbs almost by the day, because the strikes have not stopped. By the time you are watching this, the real number is very likely higher. The estimated value of the merchandise destroyed climbed toward 170 billion rubles, well over $2 billion. And the cost to rebuild just 2 of the facilities was put at nearly $500 million on its own. But here is the first thing to understand. Wildberries was not a one-off. It was the most visible piece of a much larger, much more deliberate strategy. And that strategy is the real story. Since around May 2026, Ukraine has been running what analysts have called a logistics lockdown. The idea is a fundamental shift in targeting. Instead of hurling everything at the heavily defended front line, Ukraine reaches over it, striking the supply routes that feed the Russian army from 100 to 200 kilometers behind the fighting: roads, bridges, railways, fuel and ammunition depots, and above all, the trucks and trains that carry it all forward. And the numbers coming out of that campaign are staggering. Since the start of 2026, more than 1,000 strikes deep behind Russian lines have been geolocated, with something like a third of them aimed at warehouses and fuel and energy infrastructure. Ukrainian units reported destroying over 500 trucks in just May and June. One single unit claimed 216 vehicles destroyed in 10 days. Around 20 trains have been hit since January, many of them fuel trains. And the effect on the ground is measurable. On one major supply highway, the R280, daily traffic reportedly collapsed from around 11,000 vehicles a day down to about 6,500, as Russian logistics simply stopped using roads that had become hunting grounds. Analysts began predicting Russian fuel and ammunition shortages at the front by the end of the summer, if the pace held. And the tool making all of this possible is a specific kind of drone. And it is important to be precise here, because there is a lot of confusion about this. These are not the little quadcopter FPV drones that hunt tanks at the front line. Those racing drone-sized machines only reach a few kilometers. To strike a warehouse 300 or 400 kilometers inside Russia, and in some cases over 1,000, you need a completely different weapon, a long-range, fixed-wing drone. An airplane, essentially. Small, propeller-driven, packed with fuel and a warhead, it flies for hours toward its target and dives into it. The Wildberries warehouses were hit largely by drones from Ukraine's Firepoint family, the FP-1, and its harder-hitting cousin, the FP-2, which carries a 100-kilogram warhead, alongside a whole zoo of similar systems with names like the Bulava, the Ram-2X, and the Lyuty. Ukraine now fields at least 14 different types of these long-range strike drones, many with AI-assisted guidance and satellite links, and it is building them at an industrial scale. One manufacturer alone has spoken of producing over 100,000 of the FP-class drones. And here is the decisive point. While none of these is as cheap as a frontline FPV, every one of them is dramatically cheaper than the cruise missile you would otherwise need to reach that deep. By some estimates, dozens of times cheaper. Cheap enough and plentiful enough to send again and again and again, until the rear of the largest country on Earth stops being a safe place to store anything. Russia's own defense ministry inadvertently confirmed the scale. Over a single 2-day stretch in July, it claimed to have shot down more than 240 Ukrainian fixed-wing drones. Now we get to the part that actually matters. The deep analysis of why this hurts so much more than a burning building suggests. Because if you only see smoke rising over a warehouse, you are missing the real damage. Let me take you through it, layer by layer, because each one goes deeper than the last. Start with the simplest layer, fuel. This is the basic logic of hitting the rear instead of the front. When a drone destroys a fuel truck near the front line, it might burn a few hundred liters. But when a drone hits a fuel train or a tanker depot 200 kilometers back, it destroys tons of fuel at once, fuel that would have supplied dozens of vehicles for weeks. You get vastly more military effect per drone by hitting the concentration in the rear than the trickle at the front. And critically, it forces Russia into an impossible defensive problem. To protect the front line, you concentrate your air defense. But to protect your entire logistics network, every warehouse, every rail junction, every bridge across the largest country on the planet, you would need air defense everywhere at once. Russia's greatest traditional strength, its enormous strategic depth, suddenly becomes its greatest vulnerability. There is simply too much of it to defend. That is the military layer. Now go deeper, into the economic one, and this is where the Wildberries strikes reveal their real genius. When those warehouses burned, the goods inside belonged to sellers, millions of small business owners, ordinary Russian entrepreneurs who used Wildberries the way small sellers use Amazon, storing their entire inventory in the company's logistics centers. When the warehouse burned, so did their livelihoods. Months of investment, gone in a night. And then came the detail that turned a disaster into a betrayal. Just 11 days before the strikes, on the 7th of July, Wildberries had quietly changed its seller agreement, adding a clause that classified drone attacks as force majeure. Then it applied that new rule retroactively to goods it had already accepted into storage. The result? The sellers whose goods were destroyed lost their right to full compensation. They could not get their goods, and they could not get their money. Russian social media filled with videos of small sellers in tears, describing everything they had built being wiped out overnight, not by Ukraine alone, but by their own platform refusing to pay. 3 to 4 million people work through that platform. That is a lot of ruined, furious people, and every one of them now feels the war personally. But even that is not the deepest layer. Go one level further down, into the banking system, because this is where analysts started using a frightening phrase, cascading collapse. Here is the chain, and I want to flag clearly that this next part rests on the analysis of financial commentators, not on official balance sheets, so treat the exact figures as informed estimates rather than gospel. Just 1 month before the strikes, in June 2026, Russia's second-largest bank, VTB, entered a strategic partnership with Wildberries, taking a stake in its financial arm. That part is confirmed and public. And according to those analysts, VTB is exposed to Wildberries to the tune of something like 500 billion rubles in debt. Now think about what a wave of drone strikes does to that. If Wildberries is crippled, its warehouses gone, its sellers fleeing, its revenue collapsing, that debt starts to look like it might never be repaid. And when a bank has a hole that size that cannot be filled, in the Russian system there is really only one way to plug it. The central bank prints money. And printing money means inflation. It does not stop there. That same bank, VTB, is also exposed by hundreds of billions more rubles to Wildberries' main rival, Ozon, through a web of collateral. When Ozon's shares fell 12% in the turmoil, it raised the specter of margin calls, demands for more collateral that ripple outward. To understand the scale of what is at stake, consider this. Wildberries alone is estimated to process something like 15 trillion rubles a year. That is roughly 2% of Russia's entire economy, and an amount equivalent to about a third of the federal budget, flowing through one company. Together, Wildberries and Ozon are estimated to account for around 8.5% of Russia's GDP and to employ over 5% of its workforce. Now layer that on top of an economy that is already straining. Russia's bad loans, the loans that are not being repaid, are by some analyses already approaching 20% of the system, even as official figures claim half that. Into that fragile structure, Ukraine has driven a wedge. One analyst put it starkly: the Wildberries strikes could become the straw that breaks the camel's back, the shock that forces the central bank into money printing on a scale that pushes inflation toward genuinely dangerous levels. And the clearest sign that this is being taken seriously is the reaction in Moscow itself. The government began openly discussing state support, loans, tax breaks, subsidies, not just to save Wildberries, but to shield VTB and the banking system from contagion. VTB's own share price fell. When a country starts drawing up emergency plans to protect its second-largest bank because some shopping warehouses got hit by drones, you know the drones found something far more important than shelves of goods. And there is one final layer, and it may be the most important of all, because it is not financial, it is psychological. For most of this war, the average Russian has been able to treat it as something distant, a thing happening on television, far away, to other people. The Wildberries strikes ended that. Millions of Russians, especially in regions with few physical shops, depend on next-day delivery from these platforms for the basics of daily life. When 10% of that network vanishes overnight, the war stops being an abstraction. Your package does not arrive. The seller you bought from has gone bankrupt. Prices twitch upward. For the first time, the war reaches into the ordinary Russian's own home, into their shopping cart, their small business, their wallet. President Zelensky said it directly. They are, in his words, bringing the war back home, to Russia. That is not just a military statement. It is a psychological one, designed to make a population that has been insulated from the war finally feel its weight, and to ask why it is still going on. Now, I want to be honest with you, because a video that only cheered this on would not be telling you the truth. There is a real and uncomfortable other side. However you justify Wildberries as a military supplier, and the dual-use case is genuine, these strikes also hit civilian targets, and civilians died. At least 9 people were killed in the warehouse strikes, some of them migrant workers from Central Asia who were simply doing their jobs. Millions of small sellers, who had nothing to do with any war, lost their businesses. This is economic warfare, and economic warfare by its nature lands on ordinary people. Ukraine argues with reason that Russia has spent years deliberately striking Ukrainian power grids, shops, and apartment blocks, and that a logistics network feeding the Russian military is a legitimate target. Both of those things can be true at once, that the strikes are strategically brilliant and militarily justified, and that they carry a real human cost that no honest account should hide. Where exactly the line sits between a military supply chain and a civilian economy is one of the hardest questions this war keeps forcing on the world. And anyone who tells you it is simple is selling you something. So step back and look at what this actually represents, because it is genuinely new. For most of history, to damage an enemy's economy at this scale, you needed a strategic bombing campaign. Fleets of expensive aircraft, enormous losses, total war. Ukraine is doing something comparable to the financial heart of a nation of 140 million people, using small, workshop-built aircraft that cost a fraction of a cruise missile, launched by small units, guided by off-the-shelf AI and internet from orbit. This is strategic bombing without the bombers. It is, in effect, a new kind of long-range sanction, one imposed not by governments in distant capitals, but by a swarm of cheap machines that reach out and physically switch off the pieces of an enemy economy, one warehouse at a time. And it works precisely because the target, a vast, wealthy, deeply interconnected modern economy, is far more fragile and far more exposed than a trench ever was. The burning warehouse, in the end, was never really the point. The point was everything connected to it. The seller who lost his business, the bank that holds the debt, the budget that depends on the revenue, the family whose delivery never came, and the quiet, spreading realization inside Russia that the war they had been told was far away has arrived at their own front door. Ukraine did not just destroy some goods, it found a pressure point on the entire Russian economy, and it discovered that a cheap, workshop-built drone can push on it very, very hard. If you want to understand the weapons and strategies quietly rewriting how this war, and the next one, will be fought, stay with us, because the future of war is being built right now, one cheap machine at a time.